My name's Sally Shaw and I'm Head of Programmes at Modern Art Oxford. Thank you very much for inviting me to introduce Vik this evening. It's a real pleasure to meet you and to hear more about your work. Vik did a seminar at Modern Art Oxford earlier in the week and it was a really fantastic discussion about Vik's work, but also the subject of popularism and mass audiences, which I think is something that's very interesting to me personally, working at Modern Art Oxford. I'm just going to very quickly introduce Vik, and then Vik will speak for about 50 minutes, and then there should be some time for questions at the end. So if you have a burning question, hang on to it, and microphones will be going around at the end. And maybe introduce yourself as you speak, just so that we can capture who the questions are coming from on film. The Humanitas is a series of visiting professorships at Oxford and Cambridge, bringing leading practitioners and scholars to both universities to address major themes in the arts, social sciences and humanities. Created by Lord Weidenfeld, the programme is managed and funded by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue with the support of a series of generous benefactors and administered by the Humanities Division in Oxford and the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities in Cambridge. The Humanitas Visiting Professorship in Contemporary Art has been developed in close collaboration with and made possible by the generous support of Ivorypress and Lady Elena Foster, who has supported the professorship since it began in 2011. The professorship is hosted by Magdalen College in association with the Ruskin School of Art, and this year's recipient is the acclaimed Brazilian artist Vik Muniz. Vik Muniz was born into a working-class family in Sao Paulo in 1961. As a young man, he was shot in the leg while trying to break up a fight, and with the compensation he received for his injuries, he funded a trip to New York. I hope you got more than the flight for your compensation. There he began his artistic career as a sculptor, but gradually became more interested in the photographic reproductions of his work, eventually turning his attention exclusively to photography. Muniz employs a multiplicity of unlikely materials in his practice. Often working in series, he uses dust, diamonds, sugar, string, chocolate syrup, and garbage to create bold, witty and deceptive images, which are often drawn from the pages of art history and photojournalism. In 2001, Muniz represented Brazil at the 49th Venice Biennale. Since then, he has held solo shows at prestigious venues all over the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, the State Art Gallery of Sao Paulo, MoMA PS1 in New York, the Frick Art and Historical Center in Pittsburgh, Seattle Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Macro in Rome, Juan Miró Foundation in Barcelona, and the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in Gateshead. He's the co-founder and associate editor of Blind Spot magazine, and his book, Seeing is Believing, was rated among the top 10 photography books of 1998 by the New York Times Book Review and the Village Voice. Muniz believes in using art as a force for social change. In 2010, he featured in the documentary film Wasteland, which follows the artist as he journeys from his home in Brooklyn to Jardim Gramacho, the world's largest landfill site in the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. There he collaborated with an eclectic band of waste pickers as they created photographic images of themselves out of rubbish. The film reveals both the dignity and despair of the Catadores as they begin to reimagine their lives, and it won the Audience Award for Best World Cinema Documentary at the 2010 Sundance Film Festival. The following year, it was nominated for the Best Documentary Feature at the 83rd Academy Awards. In 2011, Muniz was nominated a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador.
Sorry.
That's them now. It's a hot call, quick. Muniz was nominated a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador and received a Crystal Award from the World Economic Forum in 2013. He's a member of the Network of Global Agenda Councils and has collaborated with non-governmental and non-profit agencies on numerous youth education programs in Brazil. Vik Muniz.
Thank you. Well, this was a very generous introduction, and it seems like we're going to have a lot of time for a small talk after this. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you here. You know, I have to confess that I don't go to artist talks myself very often. It takes an enormous effort sometimes. And I'd like to thank everybody involved with the Humanitas lecture series. Especially Helena Foster, who's here, who's actually connected to this whole program. I was a little bit hesitant in accepting the invitation because I have to say that I'm a little bit uneasy to speak to an academic crowd. I always, not having exposed to any kind of formal education, whenever I'm talking in a college or to a group of academics, makes me feel a little bit of an imposter. And also, I've been involved in visual literacy and arts education for the last 20 years in many indirect and direct ways. And perhaps the feeling of involvement, the call for this kind of involvement, comes from the fact that I was never exposed to this sort of education. I think the imposter feeling is actually helping me in some way or another. As a matter of fact, I was exposed to very little education. As it was mentioned before, my parents were very poor. My father worked his entire life as a waiter, and my mother was a switchboard operator at the local phone company. Because they both worked during the day, I had to stay with my grandmother. I'm going to tell you the story now of my non-educational development before we get to the subject of this lecture. My first memory, as far as I can remember, you know, I'm sitting on a gray sofa, gray, greenish gray, almost the color of these seats, actually. I was looking at it, thinking about it. And I'm sitting on my grandmother's lap. I'm 4, and she's teaching me how to read. She drags my finger around the words of an old Encyclopedia Britannica that my father won on a pool game. It was the only set of books we had in the house. And she uncovers and covers the letters. She says the words exactly what they meant. But she somehow evokes the feeling, the taste, the scent of these words. She taught me how to read the same way she taught herself how to read, which is without having gone one single day to a school. She taught herself how to read by looking really hard at her kids' books. As a result, I was reading chapter books, you know, as my kids say, at the age of 7. I remember my favorite book then was Treasure Island. But it took me 3 years to learn how to write. Non-education, you know, has its benefits. Because I could not write during dictation, I developed a system of making these shorthand notations. It was very close to tachygraphy. I don't know how they call that in Brazil. But I would make a little short, very fast drawing for each word I could not spell. Those drawings started proliferating through my copybooks to the point that they started looking like the Egyptian wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was the only one able to decipher them. And for many years, that became a very marking trait of my personality. I was the kid that made the drawings. At one point, I started improving on these drawings by making them so often. And that identity started sinking in as the kid that stays in the back of the class drawing caricatures of his teachers and passing them around. Until I think one day I did that, and I was caught the attention to one of my teachers, a math teacher, who asked me to go see the principal. To my surprise, the principal wasn't mean to me. On the opposite, he invited me to be part of a contest of public schools for art. I remember the day I went to this place was the happiest day of my life until then, because I met kids that, like me, you know, were still involved in a type of relationship to the world that most of the other kids had already lost. When people ask me when I become an artist, I remember being in a talk like this with an artist from New York. Actually, it was Julian Schnabel, I can say it. You know, he's not here. And somebody asked him, when did you start painting? And he said, it was at the age of 5. And in my mind, I was saying, who didn't paint at the age of 5? You know, everybody starts at the age of 5. And at that point, I realized that what made me become an artist, I don't know when I became an artist, but I remember very well when most people around me stopped being an artist. I was being raised in the 60s in a climate of military dictatorship in Brazil. And as a result, not only I was interested in representation, but also the idea of how information sort of floated around was very important to my formation as an artist. In a military dictatorship, you cannot say what you want to say because you have to resort to metaphors. And now all of a sudden you realize that all the artists are developing this relationship to languages. It's actually by stretching it, by finding to which point they can mean something with something else. My cultural heroes at the time were people like Caetano Veloso and Chico Buarque de Holanda, who actually were pretending they were writing and singing love songs when really bashing the government, But there was a code, like an underlying language that was going within these love songs that separated some people from others. People felt they were intellectuals because they could decodify the love songs. They could understand, have an insight to what they really meant. Immediately after that, makes you think about studying more, about understanding the history. And all of a sudden, I called myself an intellectual. The other trait of a military dictatorship is that all the information that comes to you has to be, you have to scrutinize it. You have to know what it means. You have to know what it's coming from, what's really doing it. And you become cynical. These two things, cynicism and a resort to metaphors, I think informed my drawing, informed my interest in representation, and led me to study representation a little bit farther than just its execution. I'll say that, when I went to this contest, going a little bit back, I won a scholarship to learn academic drawing in a private school in São Paulo. I was 14 years old. Imagine a 14-year-old spending the entire afternoon drawing naked people. I didn't miss one class. And I became very proficient. But soon after, I reached, there's a curve in drawing learning. By the time I felt that I was at the top of my game, I started thinking about what was a drawing. How did people understand something within a picture? I tried to understand its history, but most, I was talking to Elena about, I developed a keen interest in psychology. There was a book, probably the only book that dealt with this subject in the library, was a book by a Princeton scholar called James Jerome Gibson. And it was a study commissioned by the Air Force in trying to improve the interface between pilot and machine for the newly developed jet planes. In this book, he talks about the entire body as a perceptual device. That was fascinating to me, because I really thought of that the whole time I was drawing, because drawing is a passive activity. And I kept thinking of how could I, take advantage of that with my entire body. And I started taking theater at the time. I tried the School of Advertising at the University of São Paulo twice, and I was a very good student. And I could not enter it for two consecutive years. And as a result, I settled for a half scholarship at the FAP, is another private school, for advertising. I thought with advertising I could use drawing, representation, psychology. But I really wanted to do was I wanted to airbrush naked people on ice cubes and sell it on whiskey commercials. It was a big thing called subliminal seduction. It was that actually got me into advertising. But soon I realized that I didn't want to sell whiskey. I wanted to sell ice cubes. There was something about it that still wasn't fulfilling. I was not after so many years of political dictatorship, we reached a point of saturation. And my generation was tired of political songs. We couldn't listen to another song by Joan Baez. It was like everything, it was like enough. There was a guy named Geraldo Vandré at that time. I could not listen to his song. It made me uneasy. And my entire generation were, I would say, we're generation of well-informed dilettantes who, instead of following with the program of absorbing politics and try to respond to it, really started like downplaying the value of our opinions and started studying very carefully the mechanics of representation. Because we realized that it was by understanding things better or making people understand things better that we'll create more discernment, better judgment. And this would be our way to influence politics. As it was mentioned, I left Brazil with that incident that I got shot in the leg, and I arrived fresh in New York to a career in theater. Thinking about that the theater would offer me the same pleasure, the circus-like excitement of the experimental theater was doing in Brazil. To my surprise, the avant-garde in New York was coming directly from punk. And for many times, I had to endure spectacles like watching 12 naked, unattractive, middle-aged men screaming obscenity for 3 hours straight, like in the show by Richard Foreman. They had that, and then they had cats, and nothing in between. Well, I slowly gave up my interest in theater, and I started pursuing what most people my age was doing at the time, just going out every night, drinking, and rubbing elbows with celebrities. But I was at the right place at the right time. And surprisingly, the East Village, that rat-infested, horrible neighborhood, started becoming the scenery of a cultural revolution in the beginning of the 1980s. There were clubs popping up everywhere and garage-sized galleries in which the gallerists actually talk to you. Can you believe that? They would be like the Indian restaurant people that would just say, papadum, come in, There would be people, there was a dialogue going on, and it was a scene that was absolutely amazing. I remember started having a relationship to gallerists and to going to openings, but it was that moment that I think, and it's a very important moment. I think everybody has to be be very attentive to this. There's a moment in your history when you realize that your generation stopped being a simple consumer of culture, and the tide started changing. And your generation is producing culture based on everything that you ever lived, all the books that you read, the TV programs, the songs that you heard. And it was in the East Village that I started encountering art that reflected my sensibility as a media consumer. Nobody had to explain to me what Cindy Sherman was all about, what Jeff Koons was doing. Besides, a lot of people was actually acknowledging the effects of media in the conscience of the world. That generation, by looking at the art of that generation, I understood my own confusion. I was probably the first generation of individuals who were raised on the spectrum of television, And by the time I was 20-something, I could not differentiate a dream from a book, from a novel, from a film, from a TV program. It was all a mess in my head. And the art of these people was about trying to find the precise point of interfacing between the world of media and their immediate experience. I thought of becoming an artist right then. And I rented a studio in the Bronx. I painted white. I found a really cool modern chair in the garbage. I put it there, and I said, now I'm going to do some art. I sat down on the chair, come. And it took a while for it to come. Making art is actually becoming a filter in which you just collect the history of your time, and these residues may become the works that you're going to leave for posterity. The wider the filter, the more you collect, the more superficial sometimes your art becomes, but that's not a problem. I thought that I have students sometimes that they are like 17, and then you ask them, what's your work about? They say, oh, it's primarily autobiographical, and I say, why don't you go live a little bit before you can tell a story of your life? I hadn't lived enough, but my experience with art, with things, were primarily filtered through my understanding of media, or my curiosity about media. Advertising is fascinating, and I fostered an amazing respect for commercial artists, I think people like Paul Rand are as important in the history of the 20th century as Warhol. I think there is a design that plays an immense influence in the way we see and we interact with the world around us. I thought maybe I could do, I felt at ease to do something that had something to do with advertising. In advertising, you give shape, color, identity to gels, to powders, to liquids, and nothing else. You can create something out of nothing. I thought about, making objects that had identity crisis. And I was a bit of a museum rat. And when I go to the museum, I come from a culture that is opposite to here, where like young trees have 200 years old. In Brazil, the oldest artifacts that you find around you, they're like from the 50s. It's like, oh, it's very old. It's like 30 years old. It's from the 60s. So I thought the first work I did is a series called Relics. This is the clown school. It's a remnant of a race of entertainers that roamed over South America a long time ago. This is the Ashanti joystick. It's so old, it was made for Atari. The entire Encyclopedia Britannica book binding in a single volume for travel purposes. The pre-Columbian coffee maker. The Tupperware sarcophagus. The fetish, Disney fetish, and the half tombstone for people who are not dead yet. Surprisingly, I got a show in a gallery in Soho, and the owner felt it was important to photograph the work for documentation and for advertising. The day the photographer came was the best day of the show. He came with 2 assistants, backgrounds, lights. It was like the works finally were at the limelight they deserved. He gave me these really beautiful chromes, 4x5 photographs. They were perfectly lit. I looked at them for a long time and realized that something was wrong with them. And to find out what was wrong, I bought, at the age of 27, my first camera was a bad camera. I loaded with the bad film, took pictures under bad light, took it to the bad developing place, and when I got the pictures, they were good. It has to be a little bit more than chauvinism. So I started looking at the wrong picture and the good picture, and to find out what was the relation between them. Actually, it was something very mechanical, it had to do with memory. The good picture, it was perfectly lit. It was the right picture. Oh, I'm all confused now. The good picture, it was a good representation of the image, but not for me, because that image had a story that preceded that picture. Children and autistic people, or any individual that hasn't had enough contact with symbolic exchange or written language, for instance, have an uncanny ability to rotate images, mental images on a visual field. We lose that as we start learning more and more and more, or reading or writing or even drawing. What we do when we imagine something, before we make it, we imagine from a specific vantage point. So if I'm to make this bottle, before I make this bottle, say it's a sculpture, I would imagine it from here. And then I'll make it, I'll materialize that idea, and finally, when it's done, I'll put it on a base, I'll walk around it, and when I find a perfect match from this physical object that exists in the world to that mental image that originated it, I'm happy. Well, the photographer had no connection to that image. I started thinking about the mental image, like this is what helps us connect to something that we encounter, as being that connection as being the stuff of art. At the same time, I was doing, had this book, was the first book I bought when I arrived in Chicago. It was called The Best of Life. The reason I loved the book is I could approach anybody and say, do you remember this? And people would say, oh yeah, sure, the Man on the Moon. Yeah, I was there, Nobody was there. But it was almost like approaching an uncle or an aunt with a family album. They would just go, yes, it was something that could be shared. these images are Pulitzer Prize winning pictures that we're tired of looking, but that from time to time we have to reload our memory of them just so we can have a better picture inside ourselves. I lost the book, and as an exercise, I didn't want this to be an artwork on the onset. I started making pictures from memory, from the pictures that I had seen before. When I didn't know something, I would call somebody who wasn't looking at the picture and say, how many buttons on John John's coat as he's saluting his dead father at his funeral? The woman from Kent State shooting, is she wearing a watch? Does she have a scarf? You know, you've been making these pictures in your head as I speak, you know. Certain images, obviously, certain things I had to fake, like the pattern on the guy's shirt, and also facial expressions. I realized they were extremely hard to reproduce. When I was offered the show for these pieces, I didn't want to show the drawings because they didn't look very good physically. And I had grown attached to them after working on them for 2 years. What I did, I photographed the drawings. I put the pictures of the drawings for sale, and I kept the drawings. It was a really good deal. When I photographed the drawings, I photographed them slightly out of focus to erase the markings of my hands. And when I printed them with the same half-tone dot pattern. It was the language in which I had seen these drawings for the first time. So it was another circle that was closed. When I showed this to people, during the exhibition, people were more tempted to question the quality of the printing than the veracity of these drawings. Because when you look at this, the important part is that the picture that's in your head and the picture that I made were met halfway. So you're looking at this picture, and you can sort of recognize, you can relate it to an event, something that really happened in the world, when this is what happened. That's the main reason why I never got sued by AP or Reuters or any of the images that hold copyright over these images, because they're extremely different, you know. But the fact that we had a meeting made me aware of something really absolutely amazing, magical, that art, it's not something that you can make it yourself. You need an spectator, you need a viewer, you need an audience, and it's a collaboration. We have this tendency to see things in things. We want to see it. We want to transform the entire world around us in language. And proof of that, when we look at clouds, we always see things in clouds, things we know. I wanted to make people aware of that power. One other thing that I discovered that in photography, you know, if you look at this, for instance, you see a guy in a kayak, a lump of cotton, and a cloud. But you can only see one of them at a time. If you think of the guy in the kayak, you forget cotton and the cloud, and you know, and so on. We are born with this handicap called attention. It's what allows me to actually deliver a lecture like this to you, but also keep us from delivering three lectures at a time. I wish I could do that. It's a bad thing, but it's a good thing because you can choose what to see. You just have to change slightly your mindset. And why not take advantage of this? This is called a multi-stable image. You know, the fact that it's done by hand makes it all better too. We've been doing this for a long time. It's not a novelty, you know. Like Lorenzo Ghiberti's Doors of Paradise in Florence. It's a perfect example of multi-layered media structure in which he used haute relief, which was a medium that existed for the longest time. It was a technique that existed for a long time, and he mixes it with one-point perspective, which was the new way to depict pictures during the Renaissance. The result of that is totally overkill. You get locked between the two modes of representation, trying to find a way out. Obviously, this is a projection. You don't get that effect, but you do get that effect when you're in front of these panels. I want to do something similar, but obviously I didn't have 16 years to make the piece, and the Pope, I don't know the Pope, so I had to do something simple. So I layered two types of representation, one very old and something that we normally tend to disregard is drawing, simple line drawing. And I superimposed it into photography. I did the two things at once. So when you look at these things, first you you look at them and you say, oh, it's just a pencil drawing. They're small like this, by the way. And a pencil drawing is something that you're most likely to judge by the degree of likeness that it bears to what it's trying to represent. But when you look at it and you see that it's not a pencil drawing, it's an object. It's made out of iron, and you can tell it's made out of iron. And it existed in a different time. Before you know, you're not just looking at something, you're thinking about the way you're looking at something. That encounter that I mentioned before is actually provoking a conversation. It's creating discernment. It's creating questioning. The questioning that's necessary for you to really understand what you're looking at. When I started making this drawing, I went through a variety of subjects. This is a monkey with a leica. I tried to put naked people in those ice slides, but it didn't work. And I started trying to explore this in a range of subjects, The first pictures ever made were lines. And I thought maybe I could try more this idea of playing with lines into the idea of distance and the idea of landscape. I used to fly kites when I was a kid, and each spool of thread had 300 yards. That meant distance, and distance is something very important in the study of perspective. I started making this landscape that looked like old prints, but at close inspections, they're just accumulations of throwing thread. The topography versus the pictorial reading of the picture are very conflicting. And you have to solve your way through this mess. At this time, I also realized that I was making a picture